Active History is pleased to present a recording of the 2017 Donald Creighton Lecture. The lecture was delivered by Professor Elsbeth Heaman of McGill University and entitled The Civilisation of the Canadas in the 1860s. It was delivered on April 22nd, 2017, as part of The Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto.
It's a great delight to be back at Massey College, where I lived for a couple of years, became good friends with Jeff McNairn, and back at the University of Toronto, which I left about 20 years ago, and where I heard my supervisor's Creighton Lecture a little over a quarter of a century ago. I got to actually, when I heard the lecture, I got to hear when Michael Bliss said, "It is now possible to get a PhD at the University of Toronto without having read a word of Donald Creighton." And Carl Berger just sort of, "That's not true." But when I came in, Carl Berger was on sabbatical, and Paul Rutherford and Arthur Silver decided not to assign Donald Creighton. And they looked at me, you got us in trouble. But I had, of course, read Creighton. I'd read him, though, in Montreal. I read him from the Montreal Perspective. And that might have colored my reading of him. And, it's nice to bring perhaps that perspective into the discussions today. And I want to actually go back to that moment when I was listening to Michael Bliss talk about politics and history, which remain very close to my heart as interests. And I want to bring in that Montreal perspective, which was not simply thinking about Quebec and French Canada. And it wasn't even simply, I would mention, Ovid Mercredi was speaking at the same time as Michael Bliss. And, Oka had been the previous year, and this was another very much a Montreal concern that perplexed me. But it was also the historiography that I did. I was not a Canadianist at McGill. I took a historiography course and I wrote a paper on David Hume. And then I came to University of Toronto and wrote a paper on Daniel Wilson, the first professor of history here at University of Toronto. And I was really struck by the overlap between them, that it seemed to me Wilson owed a lot to David Hume. And I've always wanted to get back to that topic. So here I am to revisit this topic. And I'm not going to do anything with this wonderful Napoleon Bourassa apotheosis of Christopher Columbus, which, as you see, the apotheosis is in fact Cartier and Macdonald, coming after La Fontaine, Baldwin. Maybe I'll leave it up another minute in case you hadn't noticed that at the bottom. But what I want to talk about is Donald Creighton, and David Hume and Daniel Wilson, and as well John A. Macdonald in the middle. I want to talk about the way that these three kind of speak to each other, represent constitutional history, political history, and think of them as, Canadian history, British history, and Indigenous history, because that's what Daniel Wilson did. And I want to, see how the 1860s in Canada were both a constitutional moment and a colonial moment, and how they come together. And they do come together in ways that you might not notice if you listen to the debates that are going on around Confederation. And it seems like there's a constitutional history and there's a colonial history. And how do you bring them together? What do you do? How do you understand that? And I would argue not everything that I know came from 1991 or whatever, but I would bring in some more recent scholarship. And I would just mention something that I found really useful is the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty on thinking about the way that colonial subjects never quite meet European models. It's very hard to be a kind of somebody who looks up to European history standards, like Macaulay, and then tries to write that in Canada or in India, right? It's really hard to do that, and your subjects look like they kind of let you down, right? Because they don't look like British subjects. They look like colonial subjects, and that's what he's written about a lot. And he's written, how you have to think about heterogeneity in the colonial world and the way things meet. And he's written this wonderful book on Sir Jadunath Sarkar, who is not quite Creighton's contemporary, but very similar in much of his interests, very troubled and perplexed at many levels, became, out of date because he was so imperial-minded, but really transformed history. So, if you don't get anything else from the lecture, this is a really good book that you would want to read to think about Donald Creighton. It makes him look more interesting in comparative perspective. Okay, so The one thing I do want to add, actually, that I'm bringing in here to this lecture when I talk about it, how do you think about history in the 1860s and politics? And something I learned in my comps exam, again, that first year at University of Toronto, was you think about disciplinary norms, right? I spent a year reading Canadian history to understand Canadian history disciplinary norms. I did a course in history of science and thought about disciplinary norms there. A course and a comps field as well, again. That was with Trevor Levere. Another one in philosophy of history with Dre, and thought hard about disciplinary norms in history there. It nearly broke my brain. And a field with Michael Bliss on medicine, which again, these are all areas of disciplinary norms. And I think some of the most interesting papers we've heard today have been, how do judges think, right? How do bishops think? There's ways that people have a kind of situated identity that informs what they do. And that's quite interesting to think about history from that question of disciplinary norms. And it's really quite surprising that there's been so little of that, I think, in Canadian history and Canadian political history. So in the 1860s, they knew they were making history. Okay? They knew that. They were writing constitutions. That's making history. It's making political history. That meant if you wanted to do politics, you had to think historically, because that's where the standard of knowledge lay. When Macaulay taught of that noble science of politics, he was saying you have to read history. He was a parliamentarian and a historian. Political judgment is historical judgment. Okay? I think we've kind of, we've gotten away from that a little bit, partly because political scientists tell us that they know more about politics than we do, and partly because there has been this turning away from political history at some levels. But these guys, the Confederation Debate, is worth studying as political history because they were doing it, right? It might be that you don't always want to do political history, but if you're going to write a constitution, and they did write their own constitution, right? We mustn't forget that. They wrote the first Canadian constitution. All the other ones had been written by somebody else. And they wrote the first successful constitution, okay? So that's kind of why we're here. And you'd want to think politically about that. And that's why you want to reanimate political history. And all the way through, say, the Confederation debates, the newspaper debates, you can see it everywhere. They're looking for historical precedent. How do you reason? What happened to, Greek federations or Swiss federations or Latin American federations, right? Are they relevant? And it's actually quite hard to think from, say, Latin America or the Caribbean to Canada, because somebody's always saying something like, but they weren't prepped for self-government as we are, right? So you can't reason from that. Like, there's ways in which political history can be trumped in many ways. But I want to go back and look at a very concrete, very well-known example of reasoning from British politics, which is what they do, British political history. This is the famous letter by Johnny Macdonald to Brown Chamberlain, laying out his essential political philosophy. Treat French Canadians as a nation, they will act as free people do, generously. Call them a faction, they become factious. And he says the smaller the numbers, the more determined they're going to be to protect their identity, right? They're going to hunker down and they're going to, really politicize everything. We're far better off when we're not kind of, forcing them into a corner. And he says, look, he takes these political history examples. Look how in a house of 600, Pitt was supported through Dundas by the whole Scotch vote. And remember that O'Connell, with his tail, absolutely governed England after the Lichfield House bargain. So long as the French have 20 votes, they will be a power, and they must be conciliated. That's not a trivial example. I want to unpack that for a couple of minutes. He's saying French Canadians are like Scots and Irish, okay? That politically speaking, it has the same kind of effect. Why is that? Well, they're conquered populations, they've got a large Catholic percentage amongst them, and they also tend to be more impoverished than the majority society. And of course, the conquerors blame their intrinsic qualities for that, the fact that they're Catholic having not much to do with it. The conquered people themselves tend to say it was about the conquest, right? Not about the religion. But you can see right here that if you push that logic, you can govern if you have a minority group plus a culturally cohesive, politically empowered minority, okay? That's a key to controlling the Canadian Parliament. It means rep by pop is a bit of a red herring, right? And he's right. The percentage of French Canadians in the legislature, the Parliament, diminishes. George Brown loses, Macdonald doesn't. Macdonald keeps his power base, right? So Macdonald is reasoning better from history than George Brown is. He's much better at thinking politically than George Brown is. If you push the politics further, you can also see Indigenous enfranchisement issues here. The Liberals believe, Johnny Macdonald keeps pushing Indigenous Enfranchisement Acts. They're crappy acts, okay? There's much to not like about them, but in the 50s, the 60s, the 80s, he tries to enfranchise propertied Indigenous people, status or not, right? After the Indian Act creates the status problem, he doesn't care. It's got to be with property. He would never do anything that would endanger property, okay? And the Liberals know that, so they're never going to let this go through without full respect for the property. They exploit that. But the Liberals really are doing everything they can to stop enfranchisement because they see another client community on a transnational basis that could look like French Canada. It looks like a French Canada in the making. The problem isn't that they're so different from everybody else. The problem is Macdonald can use them and hold back Canada, hold back Canadian development. So you can see a lot in this. And he thinks like that. That's the 50s. He thinks like that in the 60s too. Macdonald in the Confederation debates, he says exactly the same thing. They would become really factious. Right now, they are governed by general principles and divided according to their political opinions, but they would no longer. You would have them forgetful of national obligations, only actuated by a desire to defend their own sectional interests, their own laws, and their own institutions, right? You'd be back in Lord Durham's Canada, the one that Lord Durham described in his report. That's a problem for anybody trying to think about how to make, Canada progressive move forward. And the French Canadians say the same thing. Here's A.A. Dorion. Reasoning from history, once again. The 90 Irish members in the British House has nearly 700, but they made their influence felt. They got grants to the Maynooth College, that's national grants for religious education, religious colleges. It would be the same way with Lower Canada, and we could bring your political system to a standstill. You say, we're going to let you get away with federal union, but you make an inch step towards legislative union, and that's what we're going to do. And he says, again, and this is a really polemical statement, the next one that he says, English Canadians in Quebec ought to take nothing on trust upon entering a new state of existence, and neither would we. We should not trust anybody. Either we're strong enough to fight for what we want, or we have to have some kind of protection of what we want. Nothing on trust. And Darcy McGee thinks this is repellent. He's not the only one, sort of nice dude. He says, that is a glorious doctrine to instill into society. But McGee says the same thing. Okay, he quotes Archbishop Connolly. Connolly quoted by McGee, the Americans, we cannot trust them. They are a military people. They will have the power to strike when they please, and this is precisely the kernel and only touch point of the whole question. No nation ever had the power of conquest that did not use it or abuse it at the very first opportunity. All that is said of the magnanimity and forbearance of mighty nations can be explained on the principle of sheer inexpediency, as the world knows. And he's not the only one to quote Archbishop Connolly on exactly that point. Somebody else does as well a few hundred pages later when they've clearly, their mind's about as foggy as ours is after days. Another member says, in this boasted age of civilization, the doctrine that might is right prevails as strongly as in the 17th century. And he instances, real forceful activities going on. And this is the Thucydides Thesis, the Athenian thesis, studied by Clifford Orwin here at the University of Toronto, essentially that might will always govern to its limits. And this is a conventional norm. This is a disciplinary convention. Historians know this. This is political history. They know their Thucydides. Not everybody, but people who'd had a liberal education, as many of these people had, and somebody like John Macdonald, who didn't have it, read it, he read widely, would know that this was one of the basic political truths. And it plays out domestically as well as internationally, right? You can't trust the Americans because they are strong. They will invade Canada. This is not speculation, it's coming, right? Unless we can do something to persuade them that it's not going to, it's a bad idea. Their good mood, their good temper, however much we like them now, is not something we can trust to. So we make ourselves strong. They really have a gun held to their head is why they unite. And many people, say, we don't want to do this, but we feel we have to. But the question becomes, how do you stop a majority within Canada then from bullying the minority? You have to push everybody together, but you have this question of trust, generosity, and making sure that the majority won't bully the minority. And this is the question for I don't even know what comes next. I think Dorian saying, Experience shows majorities are always aggressive. The English-Canadian majority will bully the French-Canadian minority unless there's some way designed to stop it. How can you stop it? Well, of course, we might say, what about rights? Have you thought about rights? That might be one way to solve this problem. And that's the choice they don't make. They make it in terms of schooling, okay? Only schooling. And schooling is not a federal matter, okay? They're not giving any kind of federal protection of rights. Why not? I think there's two reasons. And one is it is so repellent to be told don't trust anybody. And many people say you can't found a political community on that. You can't do it. It will erode the 25 years of progress that we've made, okay? And secondly, because the wrong rights are going to get protected, and rights that are still not recognized today. What these liberal founders of Canada recognize, because it is an age of liberal political economy, they are, essentially liberal economists, right? Thinking in that way, every right, every political demand has resource implications, right? That's the problem of Canada. People are making resource demands on the federal government, on the United Government of the Canadas. Every demand has resource implications. If you give anybody entitlements, claims to the national government, whether you understand that as the Canadas or as the new federal government, then it will be used for fiscal transfers, because that's the language of politics and power, and that's what everybody cares about, okay? And that's something I learned from doing tax history. I'm going to put my book up. Oh, yeah, sorry, I wanted to, I can't see, you guys can see what the next slide is, I have really no idea. So I'm just winging it. But I can't help thinking that, this is a wonderful picture, because the English-Canadian warriors are sitting here looking really grim. That's English Canada power. Galt, Brown, Macdonald. These are the guys that, everybody else is going to have to deal with, right? Tupper, Taché, Tilley, Cartier, McCulloch. Those are the regional/ethnic brokers versus English Canada. And they look pretty grim. They're not happy. Okay. Politics is all about taxation, as I don't think I have to say now. I think that's been said for me. And I put this image up. This is the Montreal Tax Office in the 1870s. And you have to understand the Constitution was designed for situations like this. Here we have a new tax law coming in. The bon bourgeois absolutely hates it. The working man loves it. And behind you have what looks like a widow, a poor woman of some sort with her hand raised in supplication, asking for consideration of some sort. And believe me, I've been through the files of the Montreal Tax Offices. Widows, they write a lot of letters. There's a system for getting out of your taxes if you write a begging letter, and there's a lot of them. And widows in particular are likely to get consideration. Well, it costs pennies. The pennies that are written off for widows compared to the amount written off for everybody else. But the Constitution is designed to make sure that that guy doesn't have too much access to the other guy's wallet, right? The point of the way you run a property system for somebody like John, and none of them are Democrats, right? None of them want to see the poor man making demands on the rich man's purse, able to demand entitlement as transfers. They just don't want that. The Constitution is designed to make sure that doesn't happen. And it's partly designed to make sure that happens because George Brown is obsessed with the idea that French Canadians have a lot less money than English Canadians. And Johnny Macdonald is ruining the country and corrupting it by transferring all the wealth of Upper Canada to Lower Canada, right? That's his problem. He's got two problems with Confederation. One, rep by pop. The other is the transfer of money. And so power in the 19th century, it's not just that the Americans have an army, okay, and a big one. They have a big army because they're rich. They're a wealthy people. The British have modern liberties and power and empire because they're a wealthy people. Canada does not feel so wealthy. So it has to make sure, if it's going to be strong, it has to make sure it's done something to make itself not just as united as possible, but as wealthy as possible. And it's really, David Hume who writes, it's not that he's the first to say Britain owes its strength to the fact that it's a trading empire. As they say in the Confederation debates, the Romans couldn't hold their colonies. Britain can because of trade. But Hume writes that into the history of England and makes it the go-to place to understand how that story plays out. And you can see that logic all over Canada in the 1860s. You can see it in George Brown's fury about these fiscal transfers. You can see it in Nova Scotia. Joseph Howe hates Confederation because he sees that Nova Scotia is going to be a kind of impoverished imperial colony. Look at Scotland, look at Ireland, look what happened to them. They became impoverished home colonies. That's what's going to happen to Canada, right? And he distrusts an imperial rule that says, trust us, right? That's what, we've got so little power, we just have to do this on trust, and that's a terrible basis for political union for a distant and poor colony like the Maritimes. But one of his last acts as premier in Nova Scotia is to disenfranchise about a quarter of the population. He decided that if Nova Scotia was going to be politically and economically strong, the poor must not have political agency. The poor must trust him, right? And then it's so poignant that he sees this turning against Nova Scotia as well. And I do think that that's probably part of what Barry's objections are. I don't see what Dan are. He talked about tyranny at home, and I think that that is part of it. Howe passes it. Tupper says, what a thing to do, but then of course keeps it in place. And you see it in, again, Indigenous politics, right? They see their job as to protect wealth from people who don't pay taxes, and that would be Indigenous people. It's a Malthusian logic. If you don't manage your progress properly, you're going to have not a progress of wealth. You're going to have a Malthusian future ahead of you of impoverishment, okay? And I think it's a key conflict in the British North America Act. There's a new political nationalism saying, trust us. We'll all get wealthy together. We'll have a federal government to pursue development, economics, trade, right? And we'll download all the culture stuff to the provinces so you can fight about that locally, right? But the government of Canada won't be held back anymore by this kind of racialized hostility, okay? You'll have a government of trade, national development, etc. But at the same time, liberal political economy is saying everybody's your rival when it comes to government money spending. Everybody. If there's any fiscal transfers, you're going to go downhill. And it's hard to square these two very, very hardwired ways of understanding the national government. So these questions of friends or enemies rest a lot on identity, right? Any kind of a right is an identity claim. You don't get a right unless you have an identity. And the question becomes how you reason with identities in this 19th century world of politics and history. And again, this is a history question, as we've seen from that quote. So how do historians write about identity, about ethnicity and race? And these things are changing a lot in the mid-19th century. It's a moment where ethnicity is dying out as an explanatory force, where what we might call a kind of, if you think of Sir Walter Scott on Scotland, okay, the Highlanders are a romantic national identity who are historical agents in one form or another. They don't always propel history forward the way that a good, liberal political economist would like, but nonetheless, they're historical agents and subjects. And that kind of history really takes off because there's a political vacuum in Scotland. You can't, after the failed uprising, you can't write a kind of logical development story of Scottish politics. So Scottish politics is really very antiquarian, very Scots, and a good example of this is Daniel Wilson, writing, and it starts in the 18th century, carries on to the 19th, Daniel Wilson writing about prehistoric annals of Scotland. And he says, it was really Scott that got me here, Sir Walter Scott. And that is becoming a dead end. Marinell Ash talks of the strange death of Scottish history during this period, and it's giving way to academic history. There's a popular, widespread, popular romantic histories by people like Macaulay, which are pre-academic. The university history departments are new, and they're largely service departments for the faculty of law, okay? There are people, if you want to, someone like Daniel Wilson is teaching Hallam's Constitutional History of England. And that's pretty classic fare in history departments. It's very dry. Hallam for the first half of the 19th century. Stubbs is going to be the major figure, constitutional history for the second half of the 19th century. Dry, but there's no weevils, is something that's said about Stubbs. And these stories pull away from ethnic nationalism towards a very constitutional story. You take the Magna Carta and you see it as a national event, right? But you're narrowing your understanding of nation to these constitutional events. And you have somebody like Macaulay writing these popular romantic histories that are both simultaneously kind of romantic nationalism, but of the constitutional history, right? Political history with elements of romantic nationalism where the nation is really the hero. And it's very much, again, everybody's measured in their relationship to this modernizing nation. So Macaulay says, for example, the English and the Scots are both pretty civilized, and Irish and Labrador Indians are, on the lower scale of that story of national progress, except, people like Highland Scots are kind of in the middle, right? They're not as civilized as Lowland Scots. And you do these kinds of, comparisons of stagial history and ethnicity and character. And anybody who's doing national history is thinking like that, right? You can see it in Macdonald reasoning from one community to another, how they act according to their identity. It's in Hume, who says, you want to understand the English and the French, look at the Romans and the Greeks. It's in Thucydides, who reasons from Athenian national character or city character to Spartan, which are very different. Characters, whether individuals or nations, make choices in response to circumstances, and you judge them by the extent to which they rise and fall to what those circumstances demand of them. Chakrabarty says, I wonder, writing about the importance of character in Sarkar's, Histories of India, saying when did character, not be something produced and become something innate, right? It's a good question. And we see that same interest in character and circumstance in, of course, Donald Creighton. And he shows this same sort of career trajectory. He moves from romantic nationalism, right, commercial empire, the St. Lawrence, to much more civic nationalism. And I think he learned that from his long and intense engagement with John A. Macdonald. I think once he decided to make John A. Macdonald the burden of kind of national identity in a crucial period and studied him intently, he drifted towards a different way of writing history, as he understood that was what you had to do if you wanted to be a Macdonaldian. And I would argue that there's a real living political, constitutional, historical line of thinking that gives shape to Canadian history if you reason from David Hume to John A. Macdonald to Donald Creighton, right? All three of them, they're liberal conservatives. They're not Whigs, they're liberal conservatives, pretty Tory in their politics, all three of them. They all prefer to justify authority over liberty, executive prerogative over popular agency, civic nationalism over romantic identity. And yes, Creighton repudiated the Enlightenment. He really liked the founders, he said, the founders of Confederation. He doesn't say he really likes them, but you can see that he really likes them, because he says they are, quote, as far away from the dogmas of the 18th century Enlightenment as they were from 20th century obsessions with race and with racial and cultural separatism. I think he would add 21st century if he heard us. They were mid-Victorian British colonials who had grown up in a political system which they valued and which they had not the slightest intention of trying to change by revolution. For them, the favorite political myths of the Enlightenment did not possess an even quaintly antiquarian interest. And I think Creighton was being disingenuous. I think he knew very well that the Scottish Enlightenment was hardwired in Macdonald, and there's a direct line to 20th century racializations that he actually, is in dialogue with. Okay, so as I say, the standards of history are changing. And what is happening about the 1860s, you get the decline of ethnic nationalism as a political force. You get, secondly, the rise of the liberal legal history of the academics. And thirdly, you get the rise of race as an explanatory paradigm. And this is quite clearly emerging. There's a huge ferment of social theorizing, racial theorizing during the 1850s and 60s. In 1864, a Darwin ethnologist, name is Farrar, says at the British Association for the Advancement of Sciences, there was at one time an impression that the diversities of type and complexion observable in the human race might easily be accounted for from the effects of climate, custom, food, and manner of life. This opinion is now entirely abandoned by the majority of scientific men. And race is not going to be constructed by historians. It's going to be constructed more as something you study, as a scientific concept in the emerging discipline of anthropology. And it will be outside history, okay? It's written in ways that it's sort of, it doesn't have historical agency. People get stuck in their race and they get stuck in historical eras. So I want to talk about how that happens. I want to talk about, and I'm going to bring it in here, the story of civilization. And I'm going to take this to Hume, because Hume is the one who makes history the story of civilization, who really introduces modern history as it gets taken up. And he does some really interesting and new things with history. He starts as a philosopher, and he argues that all knowledge is essentially experience, okay? That everything we know comes to us from our experience. If I were to drop this pencil and it goes downward, I might not know why it flies downward or drops or whatever. Maybe it has an intrinsic quality that makes it happen. But it means the next time I drop it, I'm going to expect it to fall again. That's what humans do. That's what they call thinking, right? Assuming that things will repeat themselves. Nancy Partner, for whom I wrote that term paper on Hume, argues that, quote, black hole epistemology can be ignored with the same little lurch of faith that takes us out of bed each morning, rashly confident that the floor will be where we left it. That's experience. You expect a lot of things to be the same, reasonably so. And Hume says, you know, that's pretty reasonable. He's a common sense philosopher. He thinks common sense is probably a better guide to the world than most philosophy, okay? And once he figures that out, he turns from philosophy to history, as one would. Of course, I'm married to a philosopher, by the way. Never failed to point this out to him. And essentially, public opinion helps us to form our ideas. And it helps us to form our national destinies. You know, what people think matters for historical purposes. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It might as well be true because, you know, it's not more wrong than what we think facts are. I mean, I would argue that Hume is a bit like Edward Said, right? He's a skeptic. He blows truth and facts out of the water. He doesn't really believe in them, but he still writes good history. And his philosophy, total failure in his day, never fell dead born from the press, he says. His histories are massively important. He becomes the first man of letters to live entirely by his pen. They sell in the hundreds of issues. Well into the 19th century, everybody's reading Hume. And they tried to get him to do a final edition on history. He stopped in 1688, and he said, you know, I'm too old, too fat, too rich, and too lazy to do any more history writing. Thank you very much. So we all have a little further to aspire to, I think. So what does he do as a historian? He explodes all the predominant history myths of the day, the ones that the Whigs love, whereby liberty is the direct descendant of the Magna Carta, right? He explodes the Tory myths of the day as well, and he above all explodes the Christian myths that says English history is just providentially the way it is, right? And he shows time and time again that probably the churchmen were behaving more badly than anybody else in any given situation. He's an atheist, but more of a skeptic than a dogmatic atheist, so to speak. But he also understands that there has been real benefits to the pattern of British history, that the British are among the most, probably they are, the most free, wealthy people in the world. So that's something worth hanging on to, but how do you reconcile that with the historical myths about how we got there? So he essentially, and it's not, you know, civilization is an emerging word, but he talks about civilized. Samuel Johnson won't use civilization in his dictionary. It's a neologism. It really takes off in the 1770s. But he's talking about something that has to be described in these words: civilization, civility, civilized, etc. And he's using it to talk about two registers of history. On the one hand, you have all those kings killing each other, right, behaving pretty barbarically over the centuries, doing stupid, dumb things that no Enlightenment philosopher would countenance for a minute. Right? And on the other hand, you have the gradual, accidental, non-linear, backwards often, progress of modern British liberties. Okay? And he values those modern British liberties. And he tends to say that civilization is basically, on the one hand, moderation, and on the other hand, it is, and he measures, you know, things like the Magna Carta or King Alfred by these measures, it is secure enjoyment of property and legal equality before the law in the courts. Okay? The two things that he thinks are really the basis of modern British liberty, civilization, and they're very new. He thinks Britain wasn't civilized before the beginning of the last century. This is all very relevant in, say, University of Toronto History Department. This is the way that Daniel Wilson teaches history, and he's Humean in many respects. he would be your go-to person if you were an Anglophile and needed to write a constitution. He's Hamilton's go-to guy as an Anglophile who wants to write a conservative constitution, and he is also Macdonald's, because he tells you how, essentially, he argues that the Stuarts get a reputation for being the tyrants, but the real innovators in that respect are the Tudors. The Tudors understood the decline of the barons. Merchants hadn't yet, risen. They saw a gap and they grabbed it. They innovated in ways that they took power. The Stuarts were merely trying to reassert those earlier demands, legitimate demands, but the people would not accept them anymore. Popular standards of liberty changed in ways that made old forms of government undefendable anymore. That's civilization, right? So if you wanted to figure out how to do a Tory constitution, you might want to look at the way Hume describes Henry VIII, for example, or Henry VII, or Elizabeth, or, you can go further back too. And it's really an explanation about, this is arguments about royal prerogative. Centralization of power in the executive authority is one of the key questions for Hume and for all the Whigs, for people like Macaulay, who is very Humean, more Humean than Hallam is. And these are the things that show up in something like Daniel Wilson's history. Sketch the history of the royal prerogative during the Tudor and Stuart period is the matriculation entrance exam in 1867. The final exam in history that year asks, amongst other questions, what political circumstances conspired to lessen the royal prerogative in William III's time? What gave rise to the era of parliamentary corruption in England during Walpole's ministry? What results, immediate and ultimate, followed upon the union of England and Scotland under one parliament? These are all questions you might want to ask John A. Macdonald about this new constitution that he's putting together, right? This is history in two registers. For Macdonald, he really wants to put power in the executive prerogative. And he persuades people to follow him in this, and he creates his office as one of the most internally powerful political offices that exists, right? What Jeffrey Simpson calls the friendly dictatorship. And I'm interested in how that happens. I'm interested in how Macdonald does that. He defends, Hume defends patronage, Alexander Hamilton defends patronage, John A. Macdonald wields it. Executive prerogative as well. Moderation. Hume idealizes it. I think Macdonald idealizes it. He can be seen as a moderate in the early years of his political career. That's what people are reasoning from in 1867. And yet, of course, Hume thinks the final standard is, equality in the courts and protection, secure protection of property. Macdonald and that's civilization. Macdonald introduces civilization acts that take away secure tenure of property for Indigenous people and deny them equality in the courts, right? Very clear contradiction. Something trumps those liberties. It is civilization and it is race, right? There's a new racialized version. And you get people arguing, and Barrington Walker, for example, quotes a newspaper editor in 1871 saying, the civilizations of whites is indigenous, part of their nature is congenial with their race. There never was found a nation, tribe, or society, however small, of white savages. And that's, I'm not going to defend Hume's racial politics at all, but there's an interesting question about what happens to the liberal model that Hume develops. And that's something I want to talk about, as I say, in terms of histories, but also understanding the Constitution itself as a history. When you write a Constitution, you're writing history. And I think it's worth saying, it's not that I think Hume's standards are the best ever, but I think you get interesting things if you ask what happened. And I think, in short, that if you want to do history seriously, if you want to decolonize history, you actually have to decolonize civilization. You can't leave it lying around as if it was unconnected with history. It's like, on the one hand, it's kind of like a loaded gun that you just don't want to leave for somebody else to come along and pick up. If you look at today's Globe and Mail, this morning, Western civilization, Magna Carta, glorious revolution of 1688. Really, this morning's Globe comment page, the head of the Winston Churchill Society of Calgary. And that's why Norbert Elias writes The Civilizing Process. He doesn't want the Nazis to think they can monopolize a discourse of civilization, right? And he wants to shift it to civility. And he wants to say, let's, essentially, I think it's a form of decolonizing civilization. And if you think about civilization as civility, and following the kind of models of moderation, etc., it becomes very clear that Indigenous people are negotiating with civility and the state is responding with brutality, right, in those negotiations. And I think Bill Weiser's example would be a perfect one. So what happens? What happens to that? And I think there are some post-Humean innovations in history. One, stagiohistory, comes in almost immediately after Hume starts writing. It's Adam Smith begins it in his lectures, early 1760s. Adam Ferguson takes it up, James Robertson takes it up. So the later Scottish Enlightenment, very, very serious about stagiohistory. And when you get stagiohistory, you divide history into, there's the hunter-gatherers, then you have the agriculturalists, right? And you're beginning to get these sociological categories that it's hard to move from one to the other. And instead of explaining the motion from one to the other, you have these types that manage to explain, they kind of do the work of explanation of change. And I should add, Hume is really bad on change. Hume doesn't care about change. He's not really a historian. He's a conjectural historian, which means he tells stories that let him give you examples to reason with, okay? He wants to hold out, Alfred or the Magna Carta or John as, kind of the height of good governing or the height of bad governing so that you can understand how to decide these things. You can do it with medieval evidence, you can do it with modern evidence, you can reason for yourself, but he doesn't really care about how the change happens. So he has, each section has, this happened, and then it has an appendix where it talks about the commercial changes, the larger social and cultural changes, and then ultimately says those are the ones that decided the British people they wouldn't put up with tyranny any longer. Okay, so he hasn't solved this problem of change. So stagiohistory is one mechanism that starts to racialize history writing. And second one is, of course, Malthus, coming in 1798, rewriting it in the early next couple of years, who really says, unless you do history right, it's going to be decline and poverty and struggle, okay? You've got to make sure you do this right. You've got to make sure you keep complete control of your resources and that you're not spreading them around. Don't be generous to the poor and the weak. Generosity is the wrong political choice, right? Very much a repudiation of that political ethos of generosity. And I should have said, by the way, the stagiohistory, reasoning immediately. Adam Smith is reasoning with the indigenous societies of the northeastern woodlands when he makes these arguments. And he says, well, warrior societies, very, hunter-gatherers, very warlike. Yeah, sometimes you have, in some of these communities, you have women doing a bit of agriculture, which might make them agricultural, but they totally marginalize women. Women have no political power because these are warlike societies, so they don't get to exercise that civilizing power either as farmers or as women, because women are sociable and there seem to be, So, he's telling these complete falsehoods about indigenous communities in North America because he has to choose between the theory and the evidence, and he chooses the theory, of course. So you have these very ahistorical stories that are brought in that really change the way history gets written. And if you start to look at Canada with these new theories in mind, and if you start to think about not just Canada, but again, North America, Stephen Manel's got a book on what he calls essentially the de-civilizing process, that North America is looking increasingly violent in the 1860s. You'd really wonder if violence is not a more likely future than nonviolence, right? If that pattern of the British movement towards greater and greater liberty and peacefulness and stability and wealth is not actually going to go the other way in North America because of the violence of the frontier, the violence of the slavery, the kind of liminal politics, because colonial politics don't look like European politics. And in Canada, that's a concern, and even more so the concern of poverty in Canada, because that's what makes them weak compared to the United States. So Brown thinks Upper Canada should be having an imperial moment. He thinks Upper Canada should govern the continent of northern North America, the northern part of the continent. He's like Franklin. He kind of does the math, and he says, we will naturally be at the center of a great transcontinental nation. But we can't, because we've got this guy running the country, transferring the money to the wrong people. And he's transferring the money to these French Canadians, and he's going to do it to Indigenous people if you're not damn careful to make sure that he can't do that. Okay, so it's one thing to have all these, kind of pre-liberal people amongst you. That's bad. But to have pre-liberal people and a Tory running your country is a kind of perfect storm that is really bad news for where Canada wants to go, in his view. And he talks about, he has a lot of contrasts. French Canadian people, if you look west, they have a great history. But civilization is coming, right? Their history, but civilization is what we're building now, with the English are coming, carrying it to the West. And it's a deeply tendentious reading of ethnicity, of course. And they need essentially a constitution that, and this is why I would say again that they don't talk about rights. Rights, if you bring rights into the situation, it's going to de-racialize Indigenous people. If they have rights, we heard these stories about how they're losing land in the 1860s, in the 1850s, and this process of dispossession. If Native people have rights, you can't do that. So because they kind of lose, it's the race, it's the historic identity as a racialized group that lets you take their rights away and lets you take their land. But on the other hand, if French Canadians have rights and entitlements on the federal government, you're going to racialize them, but they're politically empowered. So that lands you back in the Durhamian world or the Macdonaldian world where you have fiscal transfers. A right is a right to a fiscal transfer. And the thing that really drives somebody like George Brown crazy is that liberal political economy says don't give money to the poor, but politics means that the money's going to the poor, right? So it's the way in which somebody who's poor can claim a cultural identity that gets them political clout and resources that is driving George Brown crazy. So you need that constitution to be double acting on different communities. So the big take home, I would say, from this is that they want two constitutions, one to manage trade and national development, civilization, okay, the federal government, and the local one to do all the political stuff that, if they're not quite medieval kings chopping each other's heads off, they might as well be, but it doesn't matter because it's not going to affect civilization, the one that's the natural course of trade, right? The one that will make this little tiny part of, southern Ontario rule the northern part of the continent, the natural pattern of demography and wealth. But as you can imagine, that makes for very thin gruel if you want to tell a story about the Canadian Constitution and make it romantic nationalism. You don't get to tell the liberal story of greater freedoms because Johnny Macdonald does not give greater freedoms, right? It is a Tory coup. It is old corruption, okay? So you can't tell the kind of Macaulayan story. You can't make it romantic nationalism. And that's very clear from Donald Creighton. Donald Creighton comes into this story as a tax historian. And he says, you know what? They write about taxes in the 1820s as if it's a clash of civilizations. Lord Dalhousie says, French Canadians pay no taxes for the same reason that you can't take the breeks off a Highlandman. I should say that with an accent, but I can't. In Creighton's words, at the bottom of the struggle was a difference of social heritage as fundamental as the differences of race, language, or creed. It pitted a governing class whose deepest instincts were towards improvement, expansion, and prosperity, civilization, against the sullen, inert opposition of men who accepted unquestioningly the purposes, pursuits, and habits of their forefathers. But then when you get to Confederation, it's a different story. The French Canadians are behind Confederation, and it's George Brown who's protesting the tax transfers, right? So how do you tell that story for somebody like Creighton? And how do you tell it in a way that you're not empowering greater French Canadian nationalism by, telling them that they got that story right? And I would argue that I think Creighton's story of the 1820s reflects his experience of the 1920s, just as his account of the 1860s reflects his experience of the 1960s. So, I think I have I do have a 1920s. It's on the eve of the conscription crisis. And the conscription crisis is not just about sending soldiers to war, it's also about power and money, okay? Very much. There's Bourassa, Henri Bourassa, with his feet up on the coffer saying, I get the money, I get the war loans, I get Ontario's money. So I think he's, when he's talking about a kind of clash of civilizations around taxation, he's reflecting World War I politics. But by the time you get to the 1960s, he's got to tell a different story if he wants to make French Canadians and English Canadians all happy members of this new world that they live in together. So his 1960s, he really writes out any kind of French Canadian nationalism. Here's what he says about French Canada. There were a few important things, social customs, cultural and spiritual values that French Canadians were anxious to have under their own protective control. But in most other human activities, and in particular throughout the whole wide range of economic enterprise, they were ready to cooperate in the closest association with English-speaking British Americans. They're liberal nationalists, right? They're as liberal as you could get. If that were really true, you kind of wouldn't need Confederation. And that's about all you get about French Canada in 1867 as a cultural entity. And I think that's, again, what he learned from Macdonald. And I would argue he makes a choice. He makes a political history choice, a very specific political history choice that has been described by a historian called Arnaldo Mamigliano, writing about the causes of war in ancient historiography and modern historiography. And he says, Herodotus writes, he's curious about how things happen and why. And he wanders around writing cultural histories of people. Cultures are protagonists for Herodotus. When Thucydides comes along, a generation later, and writes about the Peloponnesian War, he doesn't care about anything except the very specific deliberations made during and about the war. Right? That's all he's interested in. Mamigliano says, we don't know a lot because, Thucydides wasn't interested in deep causes. And Creighton makes a Thucydidean choice. He writes out the double register that people like Hume and Macaulay had always written, where you have on the one hand the events and on the other hand a bigger story. And he makes a very, very flattened account of Confederation because that's the price you have to pay in order to have a nation in the 1960s, okay? You have to kind of take out what he calls are the most important parts of the history in the early part of his career, and he takes them out. But in order to do that, this is my final point, he turns his back on a very wide and broad explosion of ways of thinking about and writing history in 1860s. And I've said there's an explosion of social theory. There's Marx, there's Buckle, there's Spencer, there's Darwin, right? All new ideas of thinking about race and social structure. And in Canada, you have much of this same ferment, reconsideration of who people are, right? And I would instance J.B. Farland, who's a Catholic writer, and he argues, if somebody's not Catholic, he's not much interested in what they, he thinks everybody else who's not Catholic is basically wrong. So there's no difference for his purposes between pagan culture and mythologies and Haudenosaunee, Iroquois stories of myth, right? It doesn't matter to him. And he insists that the Iroquois are fighting wars against possessing empires that are trying to take their land, right? I mean, his politics are at some levels more progressive than the kinds of accounts you read in the early Dictionary of Canadian Biography, where Indigenous people are continually betraying French interests, right? Rather than considering that they have an interest of their own. Another example would be Riel. Louis Riel is not just writing constitutions, as we know, in writing a constitution, just like Macdonald, writing a bottom-up Whig version, radical version of the Constitution, taking a different lesson from different parts of history. But he's also, as Max Heaman has recently written up, he becomes a defender of civilization in a school debate at the Sulpician College in 1864. He goes up against the noble savage ignorance type argument of Rousseau. He says, I'm here to champion civilization. He believes he owns civilization. Indigenous people did. They really believed that they were civilized and that civilization was part of their heritage. Max says we have to learn to look for people like Riel at the heart of civilization, of Canadians' constructions of civilization. Otherwise, we marginalize people. Riel was there representing and speaking for civilization. But the final one is Daniel Wilson. He is also in the tradition of Hume. He's very much a common senseful, but very cosmopolitan. He invents the concept of prehistory. For him, it's an argument that people have history, even if they don't have written documents. Indigenous people's civilization rises and falls, just like everybody else. They are not stuck in stages. He would like to see his earliest book on this, the prehistoric annals of Scotland, which is early 1850s, he would like to see the British Museum reconstructed so that it's cosmopolitan and it doesn't have distinct kinds of, some are more civilized than others, right? But would like to see all different communities following chronologically one after another, rather than in some kind of, nationalist-based European history of civilization. He takes Darwin's argument that time is very, very long, and that means change is long, civilization is long. He rejects the notion of ethnology as it turns into this very static account of culture that doesn't change and where people do not make political choices. The ethnologist, he says, does indeed study man from the same point of view of the mere naturalist, but to do so to any good purpose, this essential difference between man and all other animals must be kept in view, that in him a being appears for the first time among the multitude of animated organizations, subject to natural laws as they are, but including within himself the power of interpreting and controlling the operation of those laws, of accumulating and transmitting experience, and above all, of looking in upon the workings of his own mind and recognizing as part of his nature a system of moral government. Self-government is part of man's nature, no matter what man. And if survivors can be protected against personal wrong, and insofar as a wise policy and a generous statesmanship can accomplish it, the Indian be admitted to an equal share with the intruding colonizer in all the advantages of progressive civilization. And he goes on to say, then their long night will be over. And again, it sounds very, patronizing, but he's actually trying to say that it is the race theory and the lack of resources that's holding them back. And by the 1880s, when it's become much more clear just how pernicious this is, he says, the physical capabilities of different races are known to differ widely, but it is not easy to discriminate between hereditary race differences and those due to particular food and habit of life. A similar difficulty has hitherto stood in the way of any definite classification of the emotional, moral, and intellectual characters of races. Some of the most confident judgments which have been delivered on this subject have been dictated by prejudice or willful slander, as in the many lamentable cases in which slaveholders and the conquerors have excused their ill treatment of subject in invaded races on the grounds of their being creatures of bestial nature in mind and morals. It's a slur, The racialization is a slur, and this is very directly the voice of Scottish common sense enlightenment, and it's limited. It says these are factions, right? He doesn't get the isms. He doesn't get the settler colonialism, but he sees that this is a slur, that civilization has become a way of stripping people of their resources. Not going to say anything about the kind of history he taught, but let's just, it is within this tradition. It's very much infused with that kind of political history. And I just want to make as a final point that the 1860s are basically a lot more, they're a bit like the Burgess Shale, of Stephen Jay Gould. There's a lot more diversity than you might think unless you go back and look for it. And Wilson is continually described in histories of the University of Toronto History Department as not really a historian at all. But he's a Herodotean historian, not a Thucydidean historian. And he actually says, he quotes Ruskin to say, perhaps one day people are going to pay more attention to the material life than to the speeches of Pericles in Athens, and that would be a good thing. We might actually learn more. So I would say that, history in Toronto and in Canada in the 1860s, there's a real tradition worth looking back on to try to understand as a meeting place of specifically colonial problems of politics, of culture. People thought hard about this. And I think we should keep this as a living legend. And I would also just note as a final point that Hume was the one who really, he took on the Magna Carta. He slew originalism. Because of Hume, we don't have the originalism debates, right? He says, don't go back to the Magna Carta for modern freedoms. The only thing that really matters is how people decide to govern themselves in the present day. They're going to find the historical precedent for whatever they want to do. So again, that seems to me a kind of useful living tradition of how to understand history, that we can study the 1860s. We sure as heck don't have to be bound to the Constitution of the 1860s.
You've been listening to a recording of the 2017 Donald Creighton Lecture. The lecture was delivered by Professor Elsbeth Heaman of McGill University and entitled The Civilization of the Canadas in the 1860s. The lecture was part of The Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto, and was delivered on April 22, 2017.